or trying to ignore environmental degradation and climate change. So it has a huge impact because, we as a collective need to take care of each other. We need to be engaging in planning. Climate change is hitting communities in very particular ways that are unique in different places. So here in Eugene, Oregon, there's higher rates of asthma are predicted as there's more air pollution as temperatures rise, or we'll have more people who want to move here. And we can do a lot to try to make the best of the situation, but we need to be planning and we need to be working together. And we need to be trying to get the United States to take stronger stands on climate change and reduce our coal and all these kinds of things. So denial matters for communities in many, many ways.
Not that I want to be one of those climate villains, but does that seem a little bit altruistic?
Well, I think that most people don't want to see their friends or their neighbors or their communities or their nation suffer. And I think that we, in this country, have somewhat of a discourse around not feeling, or say a more cynical discourse, as how I would put it. But I believe that most people do want, to see their country, their communities to thrive, and this is going to require us to stand up and to become engaged and to participate in those very strong democratic traditions of which we're so proud.
Yeah, I sure hope you're right. How effective is denial as a coping mechanism, especially with, we talk about it in terms of how it helps us as individuals and how we work our way through it. But what about corporations, governments, and communities?
Well, again, one of the things that, I think of denial as, and my interest is the kind of denial that is very socially structured. So we can think about the ways that social inertia keeps systems intact. So whether it's an organization which is unable to respond to change. Now, the climate change is currently threatening our social and political institutions. It threatens businesses. There are some that will benefit from it in the short term, but none are going to benefit very long, and most entities are actually quite threatened because of the ways it's threatening our economic structures. So there are ways that psychologists can talk about denial protecting individuals in terms of, keeping a sense of their self-identity in place. I am not a psychologist, and I can't really speak to that, in any detail, but we can also think about how in the short term, all of the ways that institutions protect themselves from social change also are operating, but that really this is not going to be a long-term in the interest of those institutions either.
One of the questions I was going to ask is if denial is the secret of humanity's success.
Well, I think, especially in the very complex societies that we think of as what it is to be in a modern society, where now, especially with the internet and all the things that weren't there when I was growing up, we have the possibility of being exposed to an enormous amount of information, and at some level, we are constantly, as individuals, choosing what to pay attention to, but also what we are paying attention to is choices made by people like yourself who are choosing what to air on the radio, and by the organization of news networks. And there are many, many complex layers that shape what people are going to think about at any given moment and day, and some of them are individual, and some of them are very much not so. So, it's just sort of what it is at this point. Whether it's evolutionarily successful or not, I think that the jury is out on that.
You were talking about when you were growing up, and you, if I'm not mistaken, you grew up in Norway?
I have lived in Norway as a high school student, but I grew up in California. Okay,
so what was the experience like being in Norway, and has that experience impacted your work and what you do now?
Absolutely. I was very impacted as a young adult, living in Norway by the sense of optimism about how government structures could actually positively contribute to social life. There's, an amazingly rich democratic tradition there, which is where high levels of sense of trust and high levels of involvement in multiple political parties, and which have youth organizations and very active local chapters, and very rich history in terms of sense of humanitarian values. So, when I was living there back in the 80s, I learned that Norway has, per capita, some of the highest levels of giving to different organizations, a very strong environmental ethic, and these kinds of things. And this impacted me enormously. So it's worth noting, since most of my book, Living in Denial, is set in Norway, that it's not that I think Norwegians are particularly in denial, actually quite the opposite, but rather that it was a really great place to sort of put the hardest questions, I think, of our time up against. And so it became a useful sort of laboratory, because Norwegians have, the highest level of newspaper readership in the world, again, very strong social and environmental values, amongst the highest quality of life when the Human Development Index comes out every year. And even they were not really mobilizing so much on climate change. And so this became very interesting to me, as well as the fact that it's farther towards the poles, so climate effects are greater there.
I've watched a couple of your lectures and where you talk about some of the work you've done in Norway. And I'm curious, how has that furthered your work, and what can we learn from it?
Right. Well, compared to the United States, at least, which is a very racially diverse, class stratified, complicated country, Norway is much more homogenous. Again, has, for a long time there was just a single television station and a few government television stations. So you have a much more clear sense of being able to say, are people exposed to information or not? And again, with a high quality of life, people are not. A lot of the kinds of counter arguments about the reasons that people might not be engaging politically on climate change in a place like the United States couldn't really fit there, and because they just didn't apply. So it became a way of sort of separating out and pointing to maybe a more clear case. At the same time, however, although it's a very different country, and all Canada, Australia, other places where there are similar behavior patterns in terms of the lack of political mobilization, or the level of political mobilization that's not that doesn't match the seriousness of the problem. But a lot of the same patterns are there. So, for example, the Norwegians that I met with and spoke with described feeling helpless in the face of climate change. They described feeling fear about the future, and they described feelings of guilt. And these are things that have resonated with audiences where I've spoken around the world. And similarly, a lot of the kinds of strategies that people have of what they do when they have those experiences are not that different either, whether it's changing the subject or pointing the finger at someone else or any of these kinds of ways. So I think that there's many parts that are unique and other parts that translate very well in different national contexts.
Kari, can you talk about how what you've learned and the path that you've been on intersects with indigenous or elder wisdom, especially in Northern California?
Sure. So at the same time as I was I had finished the research that then later became the book Living in Denial. I was doing a postdoc at UC Davis, and at that time I was working in a community along the middle portion of the Klamath River in Northern California. That's Karuk ancestral territory, and Karuk people are the second largest tribe in the state, but while they are federally recognized, they don't have the same land rights and recognition of their lands. So for a long time, and I was doing work with them around dam removal. We're hoping that the dams on the Klamath River, which block 90% of the spawning habitat for really important spring run of salmon will come out. But I was doing work on that issue sort of at the same time as I was finishing Living in Denial, and that work started taking off. And for a long time, those projects were very, very different. But stepping a little bit back, when I wrote Living in Denial, I really was hoping to change the way people thought about climate denial from the sense that people just needed more information, which is really a large press from the scientific community. The public just doesn't understand how serious it is, and if they would understand, they would respond. Or the idea that people just didn't care, that people are too greedy and we just can't be bothered to do anything big on behalf of ourselves or others. And so Living in Denial is trying to paint a different picture of why there's so little public mobilization. But as we spoke a little earlier about environmental privilege, that's a kind of a circumstance more from privileged communities. And if you think that what we need to evoke a public reaction is more information, then that's pretty straightforward. But it's a lot more difficult if you think that people are in denial to know what it is that we do. How do we break out of it? And one thing that's very useful to do is look at those communities which are very much not in denial. And if you look across Canada, across the world, across the United States, Indigenous communities are on the front lines of thinking about climate change, of taking all forms of action from climate change, whether that's Idle No More and all of the work in the streets that's been around and Standing Rock. People are gathering and doing protests around pipeline development and so forth, or whether it's the kind of things that Indigenous governments are doing through climate adaptation planning and this. And this is what I've been involved with the Karuk in particular. And as a non-native settler, it has been enormously rewarding and inspiring for me to see how a community which has way less economic resource than most is very involved in trying to do land management planning in the face of climate change. And in particular, in that place, we have had many wildfires, and as people may have heard, California has and other of course across Canada too, large wildfires, partly as a result of fire suppression as well as climate change.
Dr. Kari Marie Norgaard is with us, and we're talking about the Karuk. And how have they changed you? What have you learned?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and it's been an enormous honor to have been able to work closely and learn with Karuk people, in particular my longtime research collaborator and friend Ron Reed, who's a traditional dipnet fisherman, but so many others. Leif Hillman, who's the director of Natural Resources, Bill Tripp, who's been the lead on firework and the ecocultural resource specialist, Dr. Frank Lake, who's research ecologist as well with the Forest Service, and many, many other people. And I think that one of the things that's impacted me most is the sense of responsibility that people carry. And I became aware of that very early, and thus my own responsibility. So quite some time ago, my husband and I were in Scotland making a movie. The tribe, some 20 or more tribal people were there trying to convince the shareholders of Scottish Power to take down the dams and on the Klamath River. And of the people who were there, looked around the room, and I clearly had, probably the only one with an advanced degree, but many people who may not have been to college at all, or, had much less of what in the sort of settler cultural context we think of as different kinds of privilege and resources. And people were fighting so hard and so clear about why they were doing what they were doing and really giving their all. And there was no calculation of, is this going to work or not? At least it seemed to me that played into people's decision that they were going to give their all. And I think you can't not be around that kind of integrity and sense of responsibility